Good morning. Well, afternoon. It's morning still back where I'm from. But it is such a pleasure to be here today, and I really am truly honored to be amongst these really wonderful panelists talking about health from very different perspectives. So I'm really going to throw you for a curveball because I am the resident woo-woo person everywhere I go, and my space right now is going to be an invitation to you to meditate with me and to think about what is possible. So the intro question is not a rhetorical question to me. It is actually the question that we take to the city council meetings that we attend, to the regional meetings that we attend, where we say, a lot of times when we're looking at Black residents, particularly in the South King County, Seattle region, we're looking at them from a space of trauma. What is the trauma that has happened, particularly in the COVID pandemic, where there were, as everywhere else, disproportionate impacts on Black communities and communities of color in general, in regards to how they were experiencing the pandemic. Everything from it was really great in a very tech innovative kind of space to say, hey, we're gonna go do education online, and we're going to give one-to-one devices, one-to-two devices in a lot of spaces in a lot of our districts to students, and that'll be fine. That'll be the fix for education, only to see that most of the Wi-Fi hotspot dead zones in our region existed, as you might imagine, in certain zip codes and with certain populations of our community. And so rather than look at it from a space of how can we just look at what is not working in these spaces, our communities asked for us to center community and to lead with race in a lot of the conversations that we were having. So in the midst of a pandemic, rather than just saying, okay, we're gonna set up vaccination clinics and we're going to set them up at the places where we already have public health offices, we really partnered with our nonprofits to say, where are the places that people who are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic are living and have less access because the light rail stations have not been built in their communities yet. The buses are not running in those spaces, and the requirements to even get on a bus during our pandemic are disproportionately impacting the communities that we needed to go to. And so the general gist of the work that we do, particularly in the Roadmap Project, which encompasses the south end of the Seattle Public School District and much of the kind of suburban school districts south of that, all the way up to Olympia, our state capital, was to say, what would happen if we trusted our community? What would happen if we said, you know, they're not so traumatized that they can't participate in anything. They actually are, I also have problems with the word resilience, but they actually are resiliently just taking this as, this is the thing of the day that we have to deal with. And so as the thing of the day, we are going to come up with solutions to make sure that pleasure and joy, which are just as much our birthright as everyone else here, are centered in the solutions that we have. So with that, I'm going to ask you to meditate with me for just a minute on the non-rhetorical question of what would happen if we considered that the offspring of King Cotton and Queen Sugar was a child named Pleasure. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a moment, trust a little bit, and I'll read you a little bit of prose from J. Ruth Gendler on what is pleasure. Some people are more accustomed to pulling up the dictionary. I tend to go to poetry and prose to define words. So consider, pleasure is wild and sweet. She likes purple flowers. She loves the sun and the wind and the night sky. She carries a silver bowl full of liquid moonlight. She has a cat named Midnight with stars on his paws. Many people mistrust pleasure, and even more, misunderstand her. For a long time, I could hardly stand to be in the same room with her. I went to sleep early to avoid her. I thought she was a gossip and a flirt, and she drank too much. In school, we learned she was dangerous, and I was sure that she would distract me from my work. I didn't realize she could nurture me. I didn't realize she was the work. As I have changed, pleasure has changed. I have learned to value her friendship. Keep your eyes closed just a little longer as you think about what would it taste like? What would it feel like? What would it smell like? What would your neighborhood look like if it were centered around pleasure as opposed to trauma mitigation? What would it look like in the Black communities of the places you come from if we centered on pleasure and joy as opposed to trauma mitigation? As you're ready, please open your eyes. And I'll give you a few examples of what that pleasure looks like in Seattle. So one way that that pleasure has come to be is that at the beginning of the pandemic, as you might know, imagine, have read about, Seattle is home of places like Microsoft and Amazon and lots of tech spaces that have the resources to tackle the big problems of the day. At that point in time, at the pandemic, it was we're going to go to remote learning, and so how do we get laptops, how do we get Wi-Fi hotspots into the hands of students? And our students from those most impacted communities said, I don't care if you get me a laptop. First of all, I'm a digital native, and so I do everything on my phone, so what is a laptop? And then secondly, I can't even get out of bed in the morning. I am so depressed, I'm so anxious, I am so disconnected from your belief that education is the thing I should be most concerned about right now, when really I'm worried about, is my mom gonna make it? Is my dad gonna get out of the hospital? Is my grandfather going to be able to pick me up after I get back from whatever care environment that was still barely working at that point in time? And so we said, okay, well, what would you do? What is it that you need? And before the pandemic, we knew that mental health services were a bit abysmal, particularly for youth in our region. They complained about things like, one, long wait lists, not being able to work with folks who looked like them and understood their life experience, so they spent a lot of time just describing their neighborhoods and their conditions before ever getting any mental health support. And so when we said, well, what would be different for you? They were like, trust us. Trust us to hold circle, trust us to work in community, trust us to be together and to help each other out. And our public health service, through our Best Starts for Kids grant funding, was able to, in bit of Titanic ways, where it was really hard to turn a big ship really quickly in the ways that we needed to, was able to say, well, let's pilot some things. And so we were able to pilot a youth healing project where the youth were the ones who decided, this is what we need to have happen for our healing. This is what we need to get through this pandemic. Like, you're telling us we need laptops, we're telling you, no, we don't need laptops. What we need are to be together with other people in ways that are innovative. And so that innovation space, innovation is another word that I sometimes struggle a little bit with, but we opened up the space for the youth to be able to connect back to their ancestral ways of knowing. It wasn't necessarily an innovation, there was nothing new under the sun, really, but it was about returning back to ancestral ways of being and making space for that to happen in our policy making. I've got tons more examples. I know we're pressed for time for today, but I really do hope that you will take that question of what would it mean, what would it taste like, what would it feel like, what would it smell like, what would it look like for us to prioritize pleasure and joy in our city responses to really catastrophic times as opposed to trauma mediation, and where might we come up with much more innovative and much more ancestrally connected ways of doing different in our policy making if we started from that premise instead. Thanks.